Okay, so the last question based on yesterday's lesson. Taya, where does phosphorus for plants come from? There's a simple answer, isn't there? Which would be the soil. And then we want a more detailed answer. So phosphorus, they're going to get that from the soil, but how does it get into the soil? All right, that's fine. So where it does not come from ever is the air. And so for it to get into the soil, it's either got to be from a process of weathering of rocks, yes? So the weathering of the rocks and the water that flows through weathered rock will put it in the soil. Or it's got to come from the detritus, the sort of recycling method, and which includes feces and urine. Or lastly, it's got to come from humans putting fertilizer on. So those are the general sources. Okay. So we're cracking on today with fertilizers and eutrophication. Okay. And so I touched on this yesterday. So the crops take in the nutrients from the soil, and particularly we said nitrate, phosphate, potassium. Okay. And then normally nature recycles everything. And so you can have ecosystems, small or large, where everything gets recycled over and over again, and everything is completely sustainable, environmental, beautiful, etc. But modern life, with the expanse of human beings and the invention of cities, etc., we have to remove crops from the countryside. Okay, and so there's a whole portion of the crops that does not die and decompose in the countryside. Okay, and so these ions, and we're thinking, remember specifically about nitrate and phosphate, do not go to the soil, and so are removed from the land, and they very often end up in the rivers and the seas. Okay, so we're going to look at in a bit more detail about that, folks, this morning. So in terms of our nitrogen cycle here, we had ammonium ending up as nitrate, nitrogen gas in the air. We get plant protein. Animal protein would normally go back by ammonification to ammonia, but instead it goes into human beings and is often or ends up in the sea via sewage. Okay, and we did give sewage a little bit of thought yesterday. In general, as I said, as late as the 1980s in the UK, in the River Mersey, Manchester was pumping raw sewage into the River Mersey and sending it to Liverpool. There's a nice sort of rivalry there. And then, they privatized the water companies, which meant all your water bills rocketed. You started paying a fortune for water, as I still do, but they did make an attempt to clean that. And so now sewage is processed, but a lot of it may end up buried or goes back into the rivers, but this time removed of harmful material as far as possible. Okay. But we are not recycling enough. Okay, and we did talk about this the other day, and we did say you can now sterilize human feces and use them, but there's possible the way our sewage is collected, there could be contaminants in it. It would be nice. This is a weird idea I had this morning. If we had separate toilets for urine, because urea is completely sterile and is full of ammonia and phosphate, and could put all the urine of London onto the fields. Would there be no bacterial? There's nothing to do. There's no bacterial risk. Instant recycling solution, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. So instead, what do? Okay, we make fertilizers, and fertilizers are inorganic, as they've not got carbon in them, and they contain nitrates, phosphates, and potassium, usually in different amounts. 15 gives you an idea of the amount, Nitrogen, look at this one, is normally the dominant factor. Phosphate much less, and then potassium there. Different quantities there go into that. And what that has allowed us to do, let's not lose sight of it, has allowed farmers in Europe and America, and now in Asia particularly, to produce record amounts of food on smaller amounts of land. So let's be clear of the good point of this before we talk about any negatives, that we've sort of eradicated hunger in Western Europe when hunger was a distinct possibility. Okay, so we talked with Lauren about the old days. We would have used manure, and now we switch to these powders. Okay, what do we do that for? Again, manure is a bit unknown sometimes what's in it, and when it will release. It'll have to decompose before it will release, and so there's a certain time lag before it will take effect. Inorganic fertilizer, you can control the precise amounts. In theory, you should try and control it so there is less waste. As we're going to see, some of it ends up in the rivers, unused by the plant. Now you say, well, that's a waste of money. It's a waste of everyone's time. I mean, you get all these directions with fertilizer. You've got to put them down, and then if there's an unexpected rain shower, half your fertilizer gets washed away. But there are some more slow release. There's strengths and weaknesses with slow release. Obviously, you would hope that slow release wouldn't release into the rivers so much, but at the same time, it's probably a bit harder to control what's going on. So sorry, let's go through these. So organic ones, manure we're talking about. Also human sewage can be used. It's cheap from farm waste. It's not easily lost by leaching because it's quite bulky, isn't it? So it won't, it's pretty hard to dissolve the manure and wash it, and improves the soil. Okay, so why did we move away from it? Possibly there's not enough in the first place. It's slow acting. It's difficult and expensive to store and handle because it's very bulky. It has a large volume. You've got to watch bacterial pathogens, and especially with human sewage getting mixed in with metallic ions from industrial waste. Requires heavy machinery because it's bulky. It also smells. Okay, so that's the disadvantage of using organic manure. So the inorganic, those powdered fertilizers, we can know the exact composition. You can apply it with quite light machinery. You can even apply it from a plane, although that's normally pesticide. Easy to store and handle. It's expensive because this is effectively, thinking about the nitrate fertilizer for a second, that is kind of, we have an unlimited supply because of the unlimited nature of nitrogen in the air, and we can take it from the air now with the Haber process, but that does require huge amounts of energy that comes from fossil fuels. So you'd also say it requires a fossil fuel input there to make nitrates. And then we already talked about phosphate and said, well, that requires mining of rocks or mining of guano, and that's again a sort of energy intense process. And as phosphate runs out or gets rarer, the price of phosphate is liable to go up. So there is a sort of expense problem with some of these. And then the big problem we need to talk about today is what we call leaching. And that is when the fertilizer dissolves in the water in the soil, and as water runs through the soil every time it rains, some of those fertilizers are going to end up in the rivers, and we'll see the impact of that. you've got to be pretty stupid to do this, but if you add fertilizer in too high amounts, you can actually damage the plant through osmosis. I don't think anyone in Western farming would do that, would they? Unless you unknowingly, as I say, it all sounds very simple, but it might be harder than we imagine to work out exactly how much fertilizer each piece of land and each crop needs. It's not always as simple as we perhaps suggested, and there's a problem with acidic soils sometimes with overuse of these fertilizers. Okay, so this topic is important because we can think about the word eutrophication, which is excess nutrients in water, and when that happens we get this algal bloom. And so the importance of this is, well, one, this is pretty unsightly here looking at it, and the effects can be quite negative, and as I showed you on the previous slide, this is one of the worst. Farming is now one of the worst polluters for this, causes of eutrophication, and river pollution is farming now, because we have reduced the impact of human sewage, which probably was the worst cause. So there's another dramatic picture of Lake Erie. See a boat there, and the amount of algae there is colossal. So just a bit of background here for you. Why is this topic important? A 14-month-long algae bloom in Florida, known as the red tide, only ended earlier this year, 2018. This is slightly out of date. After killing more than 100 manatees, 127 dolphins, and 589 sea turtles. Okay, hundreds of tons of dead fish. So this is very, very important, folks. We cannot be, if you don't know how cute a manatee is, here he is. Okay, we cannot go around killing 100 of these gorgeous creatures, folks. And then in Ohio, imagine this happening. I don't think it ever has in the UK, but there we go. Residents of Ohio woke to the news that overnight their water supply had become toxic. They advised not only to avoid drinking the water, but also touching it. No showers, no baths, not even hand washing. Boiling the water would only increase its toxicity, while drinking it could cause abnormal liver function, diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, numbness, or dizziness. Okay, and that is this picture. I think that's this picture here that goes along with that. I'm struggling to find how this is much different to GCSE, to be honest, in language level. So I think it's fairly similar. Okay. But obviously there's still some specific terminology we must use. So for number one there is trying to show, the word leaching. Okay, so that's a good term to use. Leaching. So this is obviously application of fertilizer spray, white powder dissolved in water, sprayed on there. And when it rains, we will get leaching of principally nitrate and phosphate, folks, going into through the groundwater, through the rain, into this is the river here. So that's number one, is leaching. Okay. Now this nitrate and phosphate is going to stimulate rapid growth of algae here. Okay, as shown. So we have rapid growth of algae at 2, and that might sound a good thing because that will be fixing CO2 from the environment as they do so, and so it sounds like a good thing in the beginning. However, there's a couple of problems. Okay, so first of all, you'll see this top layer here is blocking the light for these plants here, and so they could die. Now, at number 4, we have bacteria rocket. Okay, so we have a massive increase in bacteria here. And that is going to have a severe impact, because what bacteria do, they use this detritus now to carry out respiration. And respiration, as you all know, also requires oxygen. These bacteria, by the way, they can also feed on these algal blooms as well as they die, which they would tend to, because as Miss Neville said, it probably, you'd have an exponential growth until all the nitrate and phosphate use up, and then there'd be a bit of a crash. Okay, would tend to happen as the nitrate and phosphate eventually run out. And so at this point here, bacteria will also feed on the dead algae as well. Okay, and so to do that, they carry out respiration. Okay, and that reduces the oxygen composition, and that's something, I suppose, a sort of term we could use is we reach a high BOD, which is a high biological oxygen demand. Okay, and so bacteria can exert in high number a high biological oxygen demand. So then what you see is at 5, you'll know when rivers are polluted by looking at what we call the indicator species. So one of them would be fish, like trout, for example. Trout live in very clean water, okay, because they require a lot of oxygen. And so the minute there's a drop in oxygen, that will be one of the first things that goes, okay. And so other species of fish are far more tolerant. So a more tolerant one, which you might see increases, a fish called carp. They're very sort of inactive fish. Okay, so they don't move around as much, so they can survive with far less oxygen there. If things get so bad that the carp have died, you'll probably find the only thing left is bloodworms. Bloodworms have a lot of blood for collecting oxygen. But the overall point about 5 is that there is not enough dissolved oxygen in the water anymore. Where's it gone? Well, the bacteria have used it for respiration. Okay. Why is there so much bacteria? Well, there's a lot of dead plant life. Okay, both on the bottom and on the surface there. Okay, so that is this process of eutrophication. And I think as we said previously, for algae to grow, they need about 16 lots of nitrogen to 1 lot of phosphorus. Okay, and so actually, for a real exponential growth, that's what they kind of need. So actually, one thing we have done in Europe is banned phosphate from washing up liquids, to try and, if we can reduce that figure by half, doesn't matter that figure's high, because the phosphate level becomes a limiting factor, doesn't it, folks? Yes, Oscar.
Would the algal bloom stop more oxygen diffusing into the water as well, or would that be like a negligible effect?
Well, so for example, I talked about trout. Now, the way loads of oxygen dissolves into the water usually is like having little waterfalls and going over rocks, causes a lot of mixing of oxygen with the air. So I'm not sure the algae would have that much of a problem blocking oxygen. Well, it's possible, because obviously you'd have oxygen. Oxygen from the air dissolves in the water, and as I say, so you'll find trout and salmon in faster flowing streams, and it's that you get loads of oxygen in those, because, of an example, a waterfall will put loads of oxygen in. A lake will probably have lower oxygen anyway, and so possibly different fish. No idea. I would suggest it could have maybe a small, but
not as big as the effect of the bacteria.
The bacteria. It's a question whether that effect will be negligible. Now, obviously, the other thing is, to be honest, while it's alive, this is photosynthesizing in the daytime, so there is some oxygen coming in from there. It's more about if these larger plants die, and if they eventually will die, because you've reached a very high population. Although I suppose if nitrate and phosphate continually come in, then we could have a high population lasting for quite a number of time. But the theory tends to say that the plant life underneath dies, and also some of the algae die. And at that point, there's an explosion of bacteria. Now, it is worth pointing out here that sewage, pumping raw sewage into the river, has exactly the same effect of massively increasing bacteria and massively decreasing oxygen levels. Okay, and as I said, up until the 1980s, that did used to happen to British rivers. They pump raw sewage into the river, and the bacteria will deal with it. They get rid of it eventually. But if wherever that bacteria is released, you see fish numbers plummet. The other thing to say is biodiversity. If you've removed all these plants, biodiversity plummets, and it's you're looking at, when you sample water when near a sewage outlet, you sampled the water and you had bacteria and sludge worms and bloodworms. Okay, whereas in the fast flowing streams, you'll find all kinds of insects, water boatmen, all of those things you might do with pond dimming, stonefly nymph, mayfly nymph. You find all of those also requiring oxygen. You don't find those where there's been too much sewage. Okay. So as I was saying, there has been an attempt to limit phosphate from detergents for this reason in Europe. European Union, because if we can bring that number down, we can continue to put nitrate on the fields, and it won't go up any higher, can you see, because that's a limiting factor. But having said that, most farmers do use some phosphate in their fertilizer. You can see that you don't need a lot of phosphate, but if we could eliminate phosphate, that might help. All right, folks, I've done a lot of talking, so just give you a couple of minutes to try and reorder these statements into the right order.